In a 2012 study, some researchers decided to put some signs with a large pair of menacing eyes on these signs, and the message, "Cycle thieves, we are watching you." And they put these by bike racks that were at the Newcastle University in England. They monitored the thefts of bikes, because I guess there was quite a problem with stealing bikes, and they monitored the thefts of bikes for 2 years and found that the number of thefts of bicycles by these signs went down by 62% just by having these signs there. They also conversely noticed that the places where they had bikes parked that didn't have the signs, thefts rose there by 65%. So essentially the thieves were still stealing bikes, but they decided to do it at a different place other than under those signs where they were being watched by nothing better than a sign. You know, being watched. Have you ever felt like you were being watched? Somebody's looking at you. You know, you're in a crowded room and all of a sudden, somebody's looking at me, you know? And you just feel that. I find it really kind of amusing when I see some children imitating their parents. And when I used to have my office downstairs, and Drew, who's 37 now, was more like 3.7. He would be there, and I'd be studying in my office with my desk, you know, and my Bible's out there, and I looked down, and he had my briefcase closed up, sitting on the floor, and he'd have a little can of pencils there, and he'd have his Three Balloons Flying book open. That was his Bible, you know, and he'd have a little office set up right down there on the floor, you know. I remember another time when I was working out in my shop, and I was under my truck doing something. I don't remember what I was doing. And Drew was basically joined to my hip for the first 5 years. Wherever I went, he went. And I looked over, and he had his wagon, you know, a little pull wagon, up on a couple of wooden blocks that he pulled out of my fire bin there. And he was underneath the wagon, and he has his little Fisher-Price hammer, and he was whacking away on the bottom of his thing there while I was laying on the floor looking over at him. He used to have this other thing, was kind of funny. You seen those little spiral notebooks, you know, little flip, they're about, you know, maybe this big, and then you flip them over, right? Well, back then, I had what was called a daytimer. They didn't have smartphones. You wrote in this with a pen, all right, on paper, all right. It was very primitive, all right. But and I had my daytimer that I had. Well, he carried around this little spiral notebook, and I looked in it one day. I should have saved this thing. I really should have, because it was just a mess. Right? I thought it was a mess. All right, and I got looking at it, and then I pull, and there's no spaces. All right, it's just letters, numbers, letters. It's just it just looks like just a bunch of gibberish. But then I got looking at it, and it said, pull and turn, and then there was a little arrow. I thought, that's what's on my parking brake on my truck. And then it was Honda HS80. That's my snowblower. Like, he was walking around and copying all this stuff down. He had his own little daytimer, all right? Heard a story of a little boy, and he was watching, fascinated, as his mom gently rubbed in some cold cream on her face. And he says to his mom, he says, "Mommy, why are you putting cold cream on your face?" And she said, "It's so I can be beautiful." Well, a few minutes passed, and then she took out some tissues, and she started wiping the cold cream off of her face, and the little boy said, "What's the matter? Are you giving up?" All right, at that. There is watching to prevent a crime. There is watching in admiration and in imitation. There's watching for, you know, simple curiosity. And there's also watching to set a trap. You know, there are those who watch in order to accuse. There are those who would just look so they can twist and exploit what they've seen, you know, back in you've heard of paparazzis? Well, back in the Bible days, the paparazzis, at least in the case we're going to look at, were the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the chief priests. And they were watching for another reason. I want you to take your Bibles and come with me to Matthew chapter 12. The particular miracle that we're looking at this morning is also in Mark chapter 3 and in Luke chapter 6. And especially with this one here, there is significant things that are in the Matthew text that are not in the Mark text and in the Luke text. And there are some things in the Mark text that are not in the Matthew text or the Luke text. And there are some things in the Luke text that are not included in the Matthew and the Mark text, all right? But they're all talking about the same thing, and there's many things that are exactly the same because they were all witnessing the same miracle. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get you to follow along in Matthew chapter 12, and I'm going to interject. We're going to read through Matthew chapter 12, starting in verse 10, and I'm going to interject where it has a little bit more information that has been included in one of the other Gospels. In some places it'll be a whole verse, in some places it'll just be a little bit of information. But if you can follow along, in Matthew chapter 12, starting in verse 10, and it says, "And behold, there was a man which had his hand withered." In Luke it tells us it's his right hand. And in Mark it says, "And they watched him, whether he would heal him on the Sabbath day." And back in Matthew, "And they asked him, saying, Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath days? That they might accuse him." In Luke it says, "But he knew their thoughts, and said to the man which had the withered hand, Rise up and stand forth in the midst. And he arose and stood forth." Back in verse 11 it says, "And he said unto them, What man shall there be among you that shall have one sheep, and if he fall into a pit on the Sabbath day, will he not lay hold on it and lift it out? How much then is a man better than a sheep? Wherefore is it lawful to do well on the Sabbath days?" Luke adds, "Or to do evil, to save life, or to destroy it." Verse 13, "Then saith he to the man, Stretch forth thine hand. And he stretched it forth, and it was restored whole, like as the other." And in Luke it says, "And they were filled with madness, and communed one with another, what they might do to Jesus." Then in Matthew, "Then the Pharisees went out and held a council against him." Mark includes with the Herodians, how they might destroy him. They watched him. They watched Jesus very closely as he came into he was in the temple, and they were there watching him like paparazzi. And they watched as a man came into the temple with his right hand withered. I think it's important that I was actually going to look up this, and I kept thinking this when I was driving. I got to look that information to see what the percentage of people have left hand as opposed to right hand. How many are left-handed? Let's do it this way. I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Pretty good. How many are right-handed? Everybody else. All right? And it's more common to have left-handed than right-handed. Now, my father's left-handed, and my father-in-law is left-handed, and I have Noah's left-handed. Is there any other grandkids that are left-handed? Yes, Cole is left-handed. I think we have 2 out of our 12. So if we kind of do that, that's almost 1 out of 6, and I think it was a little bit more right-handed. So I think it's important to understand this guy was more than likely right-handed, and his hand was withered up. What we see in Mark, it says, "And they watched him, whether he would heal him on the Sabbath day, that they might accuse him." They watched him, and it wasn't just passive watching, all right? They knew what Jesus was like. They knew, in fact, that Jesus cared for others. They knew also Jesus never took anything for what he did. He healed this person. He didn't take any money for it. All right? It wasn't like he was running a sideshow or something like that. But they knew that Jesus was going to probably heal this guy. But it was the Sabbath day. And as they watched, waiting, what's the reason they watched him for? To accuse him. Well, they ran out of patience watching. I don't know how long it took. It's kind of like the kids there, that that I don't know if you've ever had this happen. When they give you a present for your birthday or something like that, and you just start to rip it open and say, "Oh, it's this," and then they got to blurt it out, okay, and tell you what it is. They're so excited about this. They're more excited about this gift than you are, which is really kind of cool because they're giving. But it's like these guys right here. It says, while they watched, they lost their patience because they were so excited. They have a trap for Jesus. In Matthew chapter 12 and verse 10, the last part, it says, and they asked him, saying, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath days? That they might accuse him. Is it lawful to heal or on the Sabbath day? Who is watching you? Who is watching you? When I was reading through this passage and studying this passage and meditating on this passage and thinking about these guys just sitting there waiting to pounce on the Lord for healing somebody on the Sabbath day, I got to think of these traps. Who else likes traps? In 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8, it says, be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary, the devil, as a roaring lion, walketh about, seeking whom he may devour. Your adversary, the devil, and these religious leaders, these priests, these Pharisees, these Sadducees, these scribes, were waiting to devour Christ for doing the unthinkable and healing a man with a withered hand. Traps are where you don't see them, because otherwise it's not really much of a trap, is it? If you know that it's there, if you step into it, you truly are blind. You truly are not looking, all right? There was a man in Corpus Christi, and he went to he was servicing the Bank of America's ATM machines, and I guess there's a room behind these machines. I wasn't aware of that. But he was in there with his tools working on whatever he had to work on, and the door closed behind him. So he's actually inside of the ATM. His cell phone was in his truck. He couldn't get out of this machine. People were still coming and taking money out of the machine, and he's inside of this machine. He could yell all he wants. The thing's so thick. It's thick for a reason. They don't want people breaking in because there's a whack of money inside there. And nobody could hear him. He had no way to contact anybody. So he had a pen and a paper. And he was writing notes, and when somebody would come to the machine, he'd slide the note out where the receipt comes out. Well, people were getting these notes, and that's a funny thing. And off they'd go. Like, this is a gag, all right? And one of the notes said, please help. I'm stuck in here, and I don't have my phone. Please call my boss. But they thought it was all a gag. Finally, somebody took one of these things up, and they called 911. Well, the police thought that they were kidding too, all right, that it was another joke. Finally, eventually they did get the guy out of this machine here. But a trap. He was trapped in there, okay? A trap is only effective, like I said, when you don't see it coming. But when these men were there and they were looking for an opportunity to accuse him, Luke adds a very telling verse here. In Luke chapter 6 and verse 8, it says, but he knew their thoughts. Jesus knew their thoughts, what they were doing. It's like these religious leaders versus God. What hope do they have? It's like when your kids are little. How many dads here had their kids wrestle with them when they were little? They like to wrestle with dad. Do you lose the fight there for a while there, Brother Dan? Do you lose the fight for a bit? Yeah, you got this little 3-year-old, and he's got dad pinned down. Well, he really doesn't have dad pinned down. It's just kind of, then all of a sudden, my dad used to do this thing, and he would lay down on the ground. He'd say, all right. And all three of us would get on him. We'd try to hold him down, and he'd wait, and, okay, you got me? You sure you got me? Yeah, we got you this time. Okay, and then he'd get up and knock all three of us to go ricocheting all over like ping pong balls. And it was just kind of a little game. That's what it's like here. These religious leaders trying to trap God. Think about it. He knows their thoughts. He knows what they're doing. But you know, why were they? Why were they so intent on trapping Jesus? I think there's a few reasons. I think, first of all, they wanted to discredit him because he didn't stand with them. Let me put it the other way. They didn't stand with God. All right? But, and you know, they're trying to enforce, I've told you this before, they're trying to enforce extra laws. They added all these other things on there, just ridiculous stuff. I had a list of some of the goofy laws that they made, and you know, there's no way that anybody could possibly live under these laws, and they would stretch things just beyond whatever, but then they would pretend like they're covering all these things and they're doing everything right. You know? I think secondly, they did that so they could lord it over the people, and Jesus is kind of getting in their way here. But I think secondly, his holiness showed their lack of holiness. I'm sure you've seen the commercials on television, you know, where the girl says, oh, I had to do the tissue test on my teeth, you know, and they take a white Kleenex and they put it up, oh, my teeth aren't white enough, you know. I just grab a yellow one and put it up, oh, my teeth are really white, you know, why not, you know. But it's making that comparison, and there's Jesus, and these guys are the religious leaders that everybody respects, and they stop and they let them go by first, and oh, yeah, well, you're Tim Hortons, you can go ahead of me, you know, and all this kind of stuff, and I don't know if they had Tim Hortons back then. It was probably Reuben Hortons or something. Anyway, just kidding. All right, but Jesus is getting in their way, all right? His holiness is, compared to theirs, it's like black and white. They felt, and I'm going to give you a verse for this one. This isn't my thoughts. They felt that their position and place of honor among the people was threatened by his very presence. In John chapter 11 and verse 48, it says, if we let him thus alone, all men will believe on him, and the Romans shall come and take away both our place and nation. If we don't do anything, the people are going to believe who he is, and we're going to lose our spots. People aren't going to respect us anymore. We won't have this be because he'll be everything that they need. Is he everything that they need? Is he everything you need? He certainly is. Let's go back here and look at verse 11. This, by the way, is only in Matthew. And he said unto them, what man shall there be among you that shall have one sheep? And if it fall into a pit on the Sabbath day, will he not lay hold on it and lift it out? How much then is a man better than a sheep? Wherefore is it lawful to do well on the Sabbath days? He says, how many of you guys, you got one sheep and he falls down and, you know, he's in a hole, you're going to leave him there until Sunday, because Sabbath day is Saturday. You're going to leave him there and just let him hope he still lives? You're going to grab the sheep and you're going to lift him out. How much better is someone made in the image of God than a sheep? Is Jesus putting the sheep down as unimportant? No, he's saying how important God's creation of man is. Remember when God created everything in the 6 days of creation, you know what the very last thing he created was? Man. All the other stuff was in preparation for the masterpiece. You know, if you're painting a picture, you know, and you got the background in there, and then this is the foreground, and that comes last, all right? And man was made in the image of God. God breathed life into man as his final creation, all right? And Jesus says, is a sheep more important than a man? And there's a key verse in Mark, because it tells us that when he asked this question, it says in Mark chapter 3, verse 4, the end of the verse says, but they held their peace. You know what that means? They didn't say anything. Jesus asked them a question, but you know what? It was not a rhetorical question. They should have had an answer for that question. But they held their peace. You know why? They were wrestling with God and they lost. And everybody could see they lost. The little kids fighting with their dad for fun, there's no competition there. There's no competition with God and man. And he asked them point blank, you know what they should have done right then and there? Drop to their knees before him. Should have dropped to their knees and, oh man, we repent, But they didn't. You know what they did? They didn't say a word. They held their peace. And then in verse 5 of Mark 3, it says, and when he looked round about on them with anger. That's Jesus. Oh, he can't get mad. Oh, yeah. You know why he got angry? It says, being grieved, this is Jesus, being grieved for the hardness of their hearts. He looked around with anger because it broke Jesus' heart that these guys' hearts were so hard. So hard. And when he looked round about on them with anger, being grieved for the hardness of their hearts, he saith unto the man, understand, as I read the passage earlier, these guys coming in there and Jesus knows what they're saying. And he says to the man with the withered hand, he says, stand forth. So the man is standing forth with his withered hand. I can imagine this withered hand. My mother-in-law was very, very crippled up with arthritis. So much so, there was other complications. She lost one arm, and I think she was in her 60s when she lost her one arm. She only had one hand left, and it was pretty much useless. She couldn't pick up a cup of tea. She drank her tea with a straw, all right, because she couldn't hold stuff. It was there, she could maybe turn a page with it or something like that. And this man had this withered hand, all twisted up, but don't know why, don't know what caused it. It doesn't tell us that in the Scripture, whether it's arthritis, whether it was some kind of accident he was in or whatever, we don't know. But he's standing there the whole time. When Jesus goes through the thing about the sheep and what's more important, a man or a sheep? And finally he says here, but being grieved with the hardness of their hearts, he saith unto the man, stretch forth thine hand. And he stretched it out, and his hand was restored whole as the other. All three gospel accounts are almost word for word exactly the same here. Where he stretched forth his hand, and it's where it was like this, it is whole as the other. You know what that means? He doesn't need some exercise and physiotherapy to make that thing strong again. It's the same as his left hand. They work. Whatever he was, he can go to work now. Couldn't do that before. His primary hand was withered up. Being grieved for the hardness of their hearts. Now this time of year, I know all the men are out there and they're watching all the Hallmark Christmas movies. All right? Ladies are saying, come on, let's get some work done. And the men are saying, no, I want to watch this Hallmark movie. Anyway, just kidding. But in these Hallmark movies, I don't care what they tell you, and you'll hear this over and over again in a Hallmark movie, follow your heart. Worst advice you can give to somebody is follow your heart. All right? The Bible is clear about that. These guys were following their heart. They were following their heart. Don't follow your heart. Follow God. All of these reasons of, why they were trying to trap Jesus and, wanting to discredit him, worried about losing their position, worried about the fact that they didn't look holy next to him. None of us look holy next to him. The only way I can look holy is by my imputed righteousness that I get from God, and it covers everything that's bad about Steve Taylor, which is head to toe, by the way. And then they look and you see Jesus. But all of those things can be summed up with this: hardness of their heart. They had a hard heart. Jeremiah 17:9 says, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? Who can know it? You can't know your heart because your heart changes. Our heart is something that we need to keep in constant check. We need to look at, because we are driven by how we feel a lot of times. And sometimes how you feel, I mean, you can be hungry one minute, you're not hungry the next, right? That's just a feeling. But you can be happy with one person in one moment, and you can be angry with that person in another moment, and we're following our heart. Where's our heart taking us, all right? But we need to watch our heart and keep our heart in constant check. Because 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 12 tells us, it says, "Wherefore let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall." If you think that where you're at is good enough, God says, if you think that you're good enough, take care, watch out, because you could be falling any second. Any second. If there was anyone who thought they stood like he'd think that he standeth in 1 Corinthians there, when they did not, it was the Pharisees and the religious leaders of that day. But understand something here. That verse, 1 Corinthians 12 or 10 verse 12, "Wherefore let him that thinketh standeth take heed lest he fall," wasn't written to the Pharisees. You know what it was written to? It was written to Christians. It was written to those who had accepted Christ as their Savior. I don't know if everyone in this room has done that, but that's who this verse was written to. Take heed lest you fall. You're already saved, but you know what? You're not going to lose your salvation. Can't lose your salvation. You know the real cool thing about salvation? It's all of God. He's the one who saves us. He's the one who keeps us. Tells us in John 10:28, I believe it is. He says, "And no man shall be able to pluck them out of my hand." I could have the wrong reference here. I'm just doing that off the top of my head there. But the point is this. It is written to Christians that take heed lest you fall. We need to keep a constant barometer reading of our heart. Constant barometer reading. How can the heart be deceived? How can we not trust our heart? Well, it's how I feel. It's what I think is right. It's what I think is good. How can that be deceived? That's what it tells us there in Jeremiah. You know, it says the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? When you let, here's the key, when you let one sin in, one sin that you know is wrong, but, you know, hey, it's not really all that bad, or one sin that, you know, because something that someone else did, now I have a right to, or one sin because you fill in the blank. One sin, just let one sin in. Allowed sin makes right wrong, makes it an option. Allowed sin makes right and wrong an option and does not have to make any sense whatsoever. You know, I'm not going to go there, but I'm going to read you a couple of verses here and understand something. In verse 13, Matthew 12, it says, "Then he saith to the man, Stretch forth thine hand. And he stretched it forth, and it was restored whole as the other." Stretch it out. It's whole as the other. Luke records. Here's the reaction. Here's the reaction. All right? Here's this man, crippled up, stand forth. He makes the announcement about the sheep. And he says, who's better? Like, is a man better than a sheep? And he sees their hardness of their heart. And he gets angry. He's grieved in his anger. Grieved for these men. Grieved for these guys that, you know what, in a very short time, he's going to die for them. And he wants them, these priests, these Pharisees, these Sadducees, these scribes, he wants them to accept him so they can come and live with him forever in heaven. So he's grieved in his heart for them. He tells the man to stretch forth his hand. This guy stretches forth his hand, he's healed. What should the reaction be? Luke tells us, and they were filled with madness and communed one with another what they might do to Jesus. Then, in verse 14 of Matthew here, it says, "Then the Pharisees went out and held a council against him." Mark includes, with the Herodians, how they might destroy him. The Herodians were a group of Jewish aristocrats that agreed with Herod Antipas. And they sided with the Roman occupation of Israel. And these guys who are supposed to be standing against what was going on. These Romans were going against everything of the Jews and everything else. You know what? They didn't like these Herodians. But you know what? We're going to find somebody to side with so that they can destroy Jesus. How can witnessing a miracle like this bring any other reaction other than awe? You would think, like everybody else, the rest of the congregation that's there in the synagogue, when he heals this man, oh wow, they're praising God, and here's these guys. Oh. That doesn't even make sense. It doesn't make sense. You know? Whose world is that reasonable logic for them to get mad? Maybe if they were in the mafia or something, but they're not. You know what they are? They're the priests, they're the religious leaders. And they saw God do a miracle here and raise this guy, and they get mad. You know why? Sin, allowed in, hardens your heart, and then you don't know the difference between right and wrong. Don't know the difference between right and wrong. And it doesn't have to make any sense whatsoever. You know, there's some sins, you know, that you can almost think, well, you know, that there's some logic to that. The guy's hungry, so he can't feed his family, so he stole some food. Well, there's some logic. It's not right. But there's some logic to that. But you know what? All sin, like when you let sin in, like these guys have let their hearts get hardened, there's no logic to this. Compare what we're talking about here. Comparing a man being healed to, doing because he did, well, it's okay if he does it on Monday. But now, what are we going to do? He heals a man on the Sabbath day. Compare that to, we're going to murder him. What can we do to kill him? They consorted together to find some way. They couldn't do it right then and there because you know what? Everybody else is in awe of what God has just done. What they should have been. They came to worship. They came with the right heart. To a bunch of guys with the wrong heart. Except for Christ. But there they are. The sin in their hard hearts blinded them to reality. Plain and simple. If we allow sin in our heart, it will blind you to what is real. That's the danger of allowing the door to open for just one sin. Just the first sin. Just a little sin. Just something. But if I allow that in, we lose reality of what's black, what's white, what's right, what's wrong, what's holy, what's unholy. You lose that. Guard your hearts. We need to guard our heart. We need to watch for traps. Because there are many that would desire to see any Christian fall into a trap. Because if they see just like these religious leaders making this comparison, if they can see someone else that they can compare, we all compare ourselves to somebody else. It's wrong. That's what we do. And if they can compare ourselves and say, well, this guy's a Christian, and you know what? He doesn't do anything better than I do. I don't need what they have. And so they're looking to excuse what they do by looking at us and say, you're a hypocrite because you do this. They're looking to see you fall into a trap. Not everyone, but there are those that do that, all right? Just to try to catch them, to justify what they are, who they are. One of the main reasons I see for some people not accepting Christ as their Savior is because they don't see any difference between a Christian and them. And it's wrong for them to do that. I mean, they can't take a look at me and see if because of me they're worthy to get saved. They got to compare us to God. There's the only legitimate comparison. Where do I stand before God? But to vindicate. But here's the neat thing. They couldn't trap Jesus because he knew their thoughts, as it tells us in Luke. We don't have that advantage. We can't know their thoughts. So we need to be very careful, and we need to, as it tells us in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8, it says, be sober, be vigilant. Being vigilant, the dictionary tells us, keeping careful watch for possible danger or difficulties. We need to be, it says to be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary, the devil, you know what? He's your enemy. He's your enemy. He can make you fall. He can maybe stop that person from seeing Christ. Or if he can make you fall, he can make you sin, or put that temptation there and to fall into that sin. He can separate you, at least in your fellowship. He's lost your soul. He can't get that once it's saved. But maybe he can stop that fellowship with you and God, and then God's not getting praised. And that's all Satan wants. What he can, every little bit at a time. But it says, your adversary, the devil, as a roaring lion, walketh about, seeking whom he may devour. Not just a little nip on the heel. Seeking whom he may destroy. Here's my thought. Do you think these Pharisees, Sadducees, scribes, priests, do you think they knew they had a hard heart? They had no clue that their heart was hard. None whatsoever. They were completely deluded into thinking that what they were doing was spiritual. That's the power of sin. Black is white, white is black. That's the power of sin. The only judge that can tell if our heart is hard or not is God. And we need to keep our hearts open before Him. Like David tells us in Psalm 139, powerful verse. Verse 23, it says, search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts, and see if there be any wicked way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. You know, David is not saying, go ahead, God, take a look. There's nothing wrong with me. That's not what David is saying. David is saying, I don't know any better. Can you check out my heart and see where I am not what I ought to be? Where is my heart hard so that I can soften that? Because I don't know. You know why? Because the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? Who can know it? And that ought to be our prayer. That ought to be our prayer before God. That God, show me what my heart is at. I want to see what's real. Because sin just puts blinders on. And then you're playing a game with what's right and what's wrong. Oh, I guess I can do this. You might as well. Because sin blinds you. All right? At least that way you got a 50-50 chance of picking the right one. No. Best way to do it is come before God. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts, and see if there be any wicked way in me. And lead me out of that wicked way into the way everlasting. We're going to sing that song in just a minute, but let's close with a word of prayer first. Precious Father, thank you for your